right, you guys ready for some more fun? We have been tackling, as I mentioned, some challenging things, and I want to talk about one of the challenging things that I don't know how pervasive it is compared to maybe some of the other things that we've talked about. I know I've heard this. I haven't necessarily heard this recently, and I don't necessarily wrestle with this with people on a regular basis. I just know there's folks out there that do wrestle with this, so I want to talk about it, and that is the God of the Old Testament compared to the God of the New Testament. It seems a little different. If you're reading through the Old Testament narratives and you're reading these stories and you're coming to conclusions and you're asking what you should always be asking of every Bible passage, what is this telling me about God and who He is? Because the Bible is an autobiography written by someone who wrote it so that you could get to know them. Why do you have this Old Testament God who seems violent and vindictive and cruel? And how can that same God be the New Testament God that says things like, love your enemies? And then in the Old Testament, He's like, slaughter the entire town, wipe them off the planet. You're like, wait a second, how do we balance these two things? Because what we're even going to see tonight is many times those slaughter everyone includes women and children and even animals. So love your enemies versus slaughter everyone. It's a fair question, and we're going to wrestle with that question because we've been wrestling with things that might otherwise make us uncomfortable. And so we're going to ask ourselves tonight, how can the God of the cross and the ultimate act of love also be the God of Canaan's conquest? We're going to talk about that. Let's be honest, first of all, with what we're dealing with, because I want to acknowledge right off the bat that you don't have to go digging in some obscure Old Testament genealogy to find the problematic places where this will creep up. It's not tucked away there. It's literally right out in the open in major narratives. In fact, you don't have to go very far at all in the Old Testament before you run into something like this. For example, Genesis chapter 6. We're only 5 or 6 chapters in, and all of a sudden what that narrative talks about is, it does, God regrets that He made human beings, and He's like, we're going to hit the reset button. And when He hits the reset button, He does save, which is another theme in the Bible, a ribbon that's woven throughout, is salvation of a few, and He does save Noah and his family. There was 8 altogether that were saved. But what happens to everybody else? I mean, here's what I love about the Noah Ark story. We like put this up in our baby nursery, right? But not that part. Not the people who are like drowning and trying to cling to the side of the ark and Noah and his family are, get out of here. Like, we don't put that part on there, but it's in there. It's not necessarily spelled out how these terrible deaths, but again, you don't have to imply anything. It's right in there that's the purpose of the flood to begin with. God destroys the entire world. Every person, every child, every baby drowns. Okay? Or how about just kind of roll forward a little bit to the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19. Now, I will say this. The Genesis 6 story, things got real weird real quick on the human side of things. We introduced murder really early on. It didn't take us long for that. But also, that's the same concept too, where things get really weird in the Genesis 19 story with the human behavior. It is abhorrent. There is absolute depravity and extreme pervasive wickedness. And it's not just a little bit, it's the whole town. In fact, in this story, you have fire from heaven, and this kind of what's depicted here, destroys entire cities. And you have Abraham negotiating God all the way down to, what if we could find 10? What if we could find 10 people who are righteous? And God's like, do your best. Can't find 10. Here comes the fire. And so it's another story where you're reading it and you're like, boy, this doesn't seem like the God of the cross. Or how about you roll forward, we get out of Genesis and we get to Exodus, and another story that's fun on the flannel graph, right, is the 10 plagues. We love covering this story in VBS because we get to sit up in the balcony and throw ping pong balls down on the crowd, for representing the hail. And we like to try to represent the frogs, from the river and all these fun plagues, right? And we have fun with them. But one thing we don't typically have a lot of fun with is the 10th one. Because what's the 10th one? all firstborn Egyptians die. And we're talking about every firstborn, from Pharaoh's son to a slave girl's child. And we're talking about children. Where we're talking about people that you and I would put, when we were putting them on trial, we would say we're going to reserve a category for juveniles here because they don't really know what they're doing. Those are the ones that are going to get caught up in that mess. Or how about even big whole swaths, chapters of Joshua chapter 6 through 12 in the conquest of Canaan. I already mentioned that. But things get really bloody there, where Joshua chapter 10 verse 40 literally says the word, completely destroy everything that breathes. So men, women, children, animals, now the animals get involved. City after city, like this isn't like a one little place. This is like an entire conquest that's happening. And the word in Hebrew that's used is harem, which means like the total destruction, like the ban, like wipe them off the planet. You also have similar stories, like for example in 1 Samuel chapter 15 about the Amalekites, where it says this, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infant, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. This is not some madman ruler who's let the power go to his head. This is the God of the Old Testament. And then you roll it forward and you've got some very interesting psalms. Now, a lot of psalms are just psalms of praise, and you've got psalms that are lament psalms, but then you also have tucked away here or there so-called imprecatory psalms, psalms of cursing. And it's where the psalm writer is eliciting a curse, very bad things to happen to your enemies. Not love your enemies. How about this? Psalm 137, verse 9. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Or Psalm 109, verse 9. Let his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. All of these are not hiding, but they're also not easy to explain. Like if someone is trying to say, what kind of God is this? This presents a legitimate challenge for us. And again, these feature heavily in the narrative of the Old Testament, and it does seem to strike a much different chord than when you turn over to the New Testament and you get a much different version, seemingly, of God. Now, I want to share, as I have this whole series, some common responses, and I will also share why they fall short. These are three that were just sort of off the top, that we could go deep into lots of different things, but these are just three. I don't want to build straw men in these, so these are like kind of some more legitimate ones. One of them is just simply that you can explain this away by saying it was just a different time. It's kind of like when we hear about, kids playing with mercury or something, or some of the stuff that happened back when some of our senior saints were growing up, and we're like, are you crazy? I can't believe you did that. Or like, when I tell my kids, like, there weren't seatbelts in cars when I was a kid, and you're just like, different time, we would never do that. And meanwhile, I'm strapping my grandson into what looks like a chair that's about to be launched into outer space just to drive to Chick-fil-A. And you're like, different time, right? Old Testament, different time. That was like, different time. Moral standards are just different back then. And what was considered sort of acceptable and pervasive as acceptable it's just different now, and vice versa, right? Well, it's not hard to attack that by saying, listen, if God's character is unchanging, and if God is the God of He is the standard of goodness. He's not just good, He is the standard. His moral nature certainly can't shift with cultural trends. It should never do that. And either killing innocents is wrong, and it's always wrong, or maybe sometimes it is justified. And so if you just say, it's a different time, that's problematic. Another idea is, well, listen, God's ways are higher than our ways. And can I say, this would have been a very short series if that was our answer to everything. We just would have said, God's ways are higher than our ways. We'll never understand it, and so let's move on. So that's one reason why that seems weak, but I will say, we do think it's true that God's ways are higher than our ways, that God's perspective is different than mine, and what seems cruel to me might be something that it serves a higher purpose. I mean, whenever my kids were little and we would take them to their checkups and they had to get their immunizations, they thought we were being very mean to them. And it was like, well, I know this hurts, but it was for your own good. And so there is some truth to that idea. And while God's wisdom does exceed ours, this just can't be a catch-all excuse because it risks making God arbitrary rather than just. Another idea here is the Old Testament. Well, you're taking it too seriously. You read those stories like, you just can't take it so seriously. They're metaphors, they're metaphorical, they're symbolic, they're greatly exaggerated. They teach spiritual truths, not historical narratives, they're spiritual truths. And maybe that's one way we solve this problem, but I see some of you shaking your heads already. That's really seriously undermining the authority of Scripture, isn't it? And also, it's a very slippery slope because where do we stop with that? Where do we just decide, well, if it's metaphor, this is metaphor, and this isn't? Who gets to decide that? All right, let's talk about maybe a slightly more nuanced approach. And I think a big part of it is just understanding the context of some of these passages. And I do think we do have to give a nod of our cap to the nature of ancient Near Eastern warfare. Because one of the things that you may not know at first reading is the language of total destruction was a standard hyperbolic war rhetoric of the time in the ancient world. In fact, you have histories that aren't about the Hebrew people, but are about, for example, the Egyptian people or the Assyrian people, where the Egyptian and the Assyrian kings are routinely claiming they have, quote, utterly destroyed cities that we know continue to exist. It reminds me a little bit of when we sports fans get into arguments with a fan of another team. We destroyed you guys. And we all know the team continues to exist, but that's the way we talk about these things. Joshua's conquest language, it might be conventional warfare descriptions. It might not be literal genocide commands. The point is really decisive victory. It's not necessarily killing every living being. It is the language of we destroy them, wipe them out. Now, there is some evidence of this because, for example, the Canaanites appear throughout the Old Testament after the complete destruction. And now, again, we can get into the weeds on, that was because they didn't follow the commands they were supposed to follow. And then they pop up in the New Testament as well, by the way. Some of their progeny ends up being in part of the narrative stories of the New Testament. And so there is a little bit of that. Total destruction might not mean total destruction. But that obviously only explains a couple of the passages we were talking about to begin with. There's also the moral condition of Canaan. And this one I think is maybe more persuasive for me personally, and that is if you had any idea what those Canaanites were doing. Speaking of bashing babies' heads against rocks, child sacrifice, very common. The idea of the religious practices including temple prostitution and extreme cruelty. And Genesis even says in Genesis 15 that God waited 400 years for their sin to reach its full measure. The idea is he was exceedingly patient with them, but their immorality became in your face awful. And so, just like when we read about in Isaiah, the Assyrians being used as God's, chastening rod against people, that's what the Israelites were being done against the Canaanites in this case. The conquest is this divine judgment that these people were utterly corrupt, and this wasn't an arbitrary ethnic cleansing. Another idea here is God as the ultimate authority over life. And I just want to say, God taking life is different than me taking life for one very important reason. I am not the giver of life. He is. The same authority that allows God to permit, not cause, but permit natural disasters or diseases and death also allows him to use, in perfect moral fairness, use human agents for his judgments. That doesn't make human murder acceptable. Only God has that ultimate authority over life and death. But we can kind of understand this when we think about even our own justice system, our own sense of justice. Because we recognize there are reasons that you are perfectly okay morally to murder someone. For example, if they're trying to murder you. Or for example, if they're trying to murder someone else. And you are morally justified in taking that life. So we understand this concept when it comes to our own justice system. It's not that hard to look at that as the ultimate idea when it comes to God and His authority over life itself. Now, I have tried to also give a tip of the cap all throughout this series about the traditional Church of Christ views of some of this stuff. So let's talk about some of the ideas in our heritage that have the way we've handled this. One of the ways we've also handled this is through something called progressive revelation. And that is this, before I say that, I'll say it like this. How many Gospels are there in the New Testament? Why do you need 4? It's the same story. And in fact, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the Synoptic Gospels, meaning the same, because they sound awfully a lot alike. Why do I need 3 of them? They're telling the same story. And then why do I need John to come along and then add his stuff to it? It's all about perspective. You know, if someone ran in here and did something wild and ran back out, and then we took each of you in the other room to interview you, you'd all have seen the same thing, but you'd have witnessed it a little bit differently and have a little bit of different story to tell. Well, the same kind of concept might be for the Old Testament being revealing a God who is a God of justice and a God who is a God of holiness, whereas the New Testament is revealing a God in the fullness of His mercy and the fullness of His love. It's the same God, it's just different characteristics of that God. Both are true, but Christ provides that complete picture of that. It's kind of the same idea if I asked you to describe me and my personality, and I asked my son to describe me and my personality. It would be describing the same person, they'd both be true, but it would be much different perspectives. Old Testament perspective, New Testament. Another idea is God's judgment versus human vengeance. When God commands destruction in the Old Testament, again, it is divine judgment, but it's handled through human agents. When humans seek personal revenge, that's obviously sinful. And the difference is authorization, and we already kind of covered that. Also, I want to go back to Jesus. I don't think Jesus is any small thing, right? Because Jesus is, all over the Bible from start to finish, but the New Testament is His special revelation, and Jesus doesn't contradict the Old Testament. He fulfills it. He said so Himself in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard it said, but I tell you, He says. He's coming to finish the story. I did not come to abolish the law, but I have come to fulfill the law. And what that moves us from is it moves us from eye for an eye to radical love. So it's this idea of Christ as the final word coming along. And obviously the New Testament sounds different because Christ is different. He is other. Let's deal with one specific special challenge with the imprecatory Psalms. I mentioned these. Look at Psalm 109, verse 9 here. It's the only specific verse that I really want to show you tonight. Let his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. Anybody looking for a memory verse tonight? Anybody have someone in your life you don't mind praying that prayer about? Would you admit that in church? Probably not. This is in the Bible. It's actually in the Hebrew songbook. That's what Psalms is. It's Hebrew songbook. These are prayers of God's vengeance. Prayers of vengeance on God's enemies. And they maybe can kind of be troubling. How do we handle them? Well, I think one of the things I love about them is their honest expressions. And one of the things I love about the book of Psalms is it gives us honest language of how our heart really feels sometimes. And sometimes we really do want our enemies for someone else to raise their children. That's how we feel at times. The psalmist brings that raw emotion. It doesn't take personal revenge. He takes it to God, which is beautiful. Another idea is they call for divine justice, not personal vengeance. Let God judge is different from I'm going to get even. They also remind us that injustice matters. A world where evil goes unpunished forever is morally intolerable. In fact, it's one of the things that frustrates us most in our culture is when we feel like people who are immoral get away with all kinds of things. So for them not to is a part of our idea of what's lawful and what's not. Christ also transforms, how we apply them. Because we can pray these psalms, and I'm not going to stop you, right, from praying this psalm about someone that you don't like. I guess I can't stop you from doing that. But what if you prayed this about your spiritual enemy? What if we prayed this against Satan? And what if we prayed this against sin? The idea is entered into my prayer life of, God, let me be repulsed by my sin. Let me be repulsed by it. Bring it out and show it to me so I can be repulsed by it. And this concept where we can pray a prayer like this in this imprecatory language about our spiritual enemy, it is certainly capable of holding that in our hearts while also loving our human opponents at the same time. In fact, those two things maybe even go together. Also, I want to acknowledge this. Jesus never explicitly addresses this passage, or these passages. These ones that I mentioned tonight, all these Old Testament ones, he never really talks a lot about them and doesn't give us a lot of clues about them. He does, however, affirm the Old Testament authority. He says in Matthew chapter 5, I already quoted this a moment ago, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. So he doesn't say, oh, yeah, you can forget all that. He also demonstrates God's heart. It says in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion over them. And so, yeah, I see the God who judged Canaan, but I also see him weeping over Jerusalem. And I think he transforms our response where love your enemies doesn't contradict God's right to judge, but it just changes the way we treat the people who oppose us. All right, one of the other things I've been trying to do in this series is I've been trying to tell you where I land on these things. And I will start by saying I believe the Old Testament passages are real historical events. I will say this with a caveat. And the caveat might be this. They are answering contextually questions that we might be asking. Or excuse me, they're answering questions that aren't necessarily the questions we might be asking of them. So even though I believe they're real, true historical events, I don't know that they're set up to answer, for example, scientific questions that we bring to them, or even historical questions we bring to them where that's not their goal to begin with. But having said that, that's kind of a little bit of a caveat. I do believe that they record real historical events, and I do believe it's recording God's judgment through human agents. I believe that's what we're reading. And I also believe they reveal God's perfect justice, because a God who never judges evil wouldn't be perfectly good. He would be indifferent to suffering. Because, again, go back and read some of what those people who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah were doing. And if you were victims of theirs, you don't consider God just allowing that to go on forever as being morally good. They also point forward to the final judgment, because if God doesn't judge evil ultimately, then justice is meaningless and evil truly wins. And the only thing I can hold my hat on when I'm reading the news these days is oftentimes God's final judgment. God's final judgment. God's final judgment. That God's going to be the one that ultimately has final say. And also, can I just tell you, they make the cross even more amazing, because the same holy God who cannot tolerate sin, he just embraced me. And he took on that sin. For me. He took our judgment on himself. All right, and I want to make a final point here, and I want to talk about living with this tension. And this kind of applies through so much of what we've already covered in this series, but I just want to bring these up tonight. Because here's what I have learned to do with these difficult passages is the first thing is I don't try to rush to defend them or to try to explain them away. I think it's perfectly fine to let them be difficult. Let them challenge you. I mean, one of the things that I think we grow out of as Christians is thinking we have to have an answer to everything immediately. One of the things that I love saying nowadays is, and the older I get, the more I love to say it, I don't know. I don't know. I'll find out. I'll look into it. I'll study it. I don't know. Hey, what about this, Inlow? I don't know. It's great question. Boy, what a great question. Let them be difficult. Acknowledge that they trouble you. And I think what that shows us is we have a heart that's aligned with God's mercy. We have a heart that's aligned with God. Also, again, this kind of goes hand in glove with all this, but just don't dismiss it. They're part of the story of God and how he deals with evil. And, one of the things we could do is just sanitize the Bible, I guess, and remove all moral challenges. But, then we're going to end up with kind of a Swiss cheese Bible. And that's not going to be super helpful. So don't dismiss them either. And then I think one of the things that could be really powerful is read them all in light of the cross. The God who commanded these judgments, He really is the same God who absorbed all judgment for us. It's the same God. And you have to read everything, not just these, everything in your life through the lens of the cross. For God so loved the world. That was true. It was always true. And also we have to remember they point to that final justice. I've already kind of mentioned this, but if there's no ultimate accountability for evil, then Hitler wins. And his victims stay dead. And that's it. And that's really sad. So we have to remember that all of this points to this final judgment. Here's what comforts me. The same God who commanded the destruction of Canaan, that he also wept over Jerusalem. The same God who sent fire on Sodom also wrestled with Abraham about finding 10 righteous people. And God's justice and mercy, they're not contradictory. They're expressions of his holiness. And I think that's what's beautiful about the cross, is both of those aspects of God meet perfectly in the cross. His perfect sense of justice and holiness, but also his sense of love. The cross satisfies both of those things. All right, next week we're going to move to a completely different kind of difficult doctrine, and that is the nature of Scripture itself. Asking questions like, is the Bible inerrant? How do we handle apparent contradictions? There's been volumes and volumes of books written about the contradictions that you find in Scripture. What do we do with those? What does inspiration actually mean? Some of those things. But tonight, I just invite you to rest in this. The God whose justice is perfect is also the God whose love sent Christ to die for his enemies. The God who cannot tolerate sin is also the God who took our sin upon himself. You don't have to fully understand his justice. You just have to trust the judge of all the earth who will do right. And he's already proven that on the cross.